So I think we are just going to get started at 6 o'clock. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for our first Australian Digital Alliance Forum 2023 satellite event, Benefits of Open GLAM Collections with Dr Andrea Wallace and Douglas McCarthy. And thank you so much for joining us. And also joining us tonight is Elliot Bledsoe, ADA Copyright Officer. Sorry, I'm just trying to work out my screens. Elliot will be looking after the questions. So if you have any questions for the speakers, just pop them in the chat. My name is Sarah Powell. I'm the Executive Officer of the ADA. And before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people as the first people and traditional owners of this land that I'm joining from here in Canberra. I pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, their communities and their cultures throughout Australia. And I invite those of you attending today's session to acknowledge in the chat the custodians and the lands from where you're joining us from, if you'd like to do so. And for those that may not be familiar with our organisation, the Australian Digital Alliance is a peak body in Australia promoting copyright law in the public interest. We strive for copyright that is balanced, flexible, while respecting the rights of both creators and users. And we advocate for copyright legislation that encourages access to knowledge, culture, education, and innovation. In this year's ADA Forum, A Fair Future for Copyright, if you don't know, will be held next week on Friday, 17th of February. And it will focus on the proposed access reforms, rapid technological advancements in AI, creators as users, and the importance of Indigenous cultural intellectual property. And we have online and in-person tickets available if you're interested in joining us. Just see how many people we have attending. Cool. So tonight's session will delve into the wonderful world of Open GLAM, which, as many of you will probably know, stands for Galleries, Libraries, Archives and Museums. And this talk will explore the benefits, challenges and untapped potential of making open access data, which includes digital objects, metadata and text from GLAM collections available for reuse. And joining us from the early hours of the morning from Exeter is Dr Andrea Wallace, an artist and lawyer by academic training. Andrea is an associate professor in law and technology at the University of Exeter. Andrea is also co-director of the GLAM-E Lab and deputy director of the Centre for Science, Culture and the Law at Exeter. And her research focuses on the intersections of art and cultural heritage law with the digital realm and digital heritage management. Her wider interdisciplinary interests consider the impact of digital technologies on the presentation, interpretation, and dissemination of cultural heritage and data. And she frequently writes and presents on open culture and the impact of new rights claimed over digital surrogates of public domain works. So thank you for joining us, Andrea. And also joining us from the early hours of the Netherlands is Douglas McCarthy, Collections Engagement Manager at Europeana. He is an art historian by academic training. He's worked internationally in GLAM for over 20 years and is a passionate advocate for open access to cultural heritage. And his areas of expertise include digital collections management, copyright and licensing. And at Europeana, he leads a team working with international museum and educational partners to showcase collections and engage online audiences with cultural heritage and digital storytelling. Douglas is also an independent researcher and author in the field of open access to cultural heritage. And since 2018 has led an international survey of open access policy and practice in the GLAM sector with Dr. Andrea Wallace. Douglas is also the editor of the Medium publication, Open GLAM, that shares insight into open access and cultural heritage from a global perspective. So after Andrea and Douglas speak, we will have some questions and there'll be a chance for discussion. So just pop your questions in the chat. So thanks, Andrea and Douglas, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, for the very warm welcome. Good evening and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. Andrea and I are thrilled to be with you. And I hope that you can see our slides clearly. And without further ado, Andrea, would you like to take us away?
Great. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. We thought we would focus our presentation kind of on this broader concept of what Open GLAM is, how copyright fits within it, and some data that we've been collecting on Open GLAM activity around the globe. So we're going to first kind of talk about what fits within what we're discussing when we refer to Open GLAM, then kind of what it looks like in practice, showing you some examples, and then thinking about the global picture, but also how Australia compares to that picture. Before we kind of move on to thinking about some of the benefits that we've been seeing materializing around Open GLAM and open policies. And again, please drop questions in the chat. We are very happy to have any sort of discussion afterward.
So first of all, what is Open GLAM? Like a lot of people these days, I thought I'd ask ChatGPT and see what it, that's the right pronoun, said. And it was a reasonable effort. So the way that I think about Open GLAM is really a movement of people, of spirited individuals who are passionate about open access, sharing knowledge as freely as possible. And the broader movement really is about opening up access to cultural heritage collections. Now it's making them freely available to the public. Yes, using forms of copyright management, licensing, other legal tools, which we'll get into in a moment. And it's also about increasing the visibility of cultural heritage collections, promoting collaboration between organizations and individuals, and essentially, fostering and making possible new forms of creativity and new knowledge within certain bounds, which we'll also touch on in this talk.
And so when we talk about Open GLAM, we're actually referring to sets of materials that are published online for anyone to be able to reuse for any purpose. And typically this includes upfront permissions, and I'll give you some examples of the licenses, the tools, the labels that are used in a second. But it's really important that we ground the discussion in what open means, because there are different consequences to publishing something in open access. So we're going to be thinking about things that are in the public domain, they get digitized, and then they're published as open, which means people can use that data, text, metadata, the images, digital assets for any purpose. They can modify it, they can share it, use it commercially. And when that sort of permission is granted, there can be some really exciting things that happen, especially even within the institution. But there are sometimes some misconceptions around this kind of tension with commercial use and the idea that publishing things online, but restricting non-commercial use can qualify as open just by having the collections online. So we want to kind of address that and set that aside from the beginning, but also because, the meaning of open carries a lot of absence of permissions that maybe should be there in the first place. And so, of course, we're referring to different types of materials that could be culturally sensitive or may not be appropriate for open access. So what we're really going to be focusing on here are those materials that are vetted in terms of public domain and have been published as open. And Doug, if you want to go to the next slide. And so these are the specific types of licenses and labels that can be applied to materials to qualify as open access. And there's a lot of kind of benefits to using these specific branded labels, tools, and licenses. So first of all, both Creative Commons and rights statements make these labels available in multiple languages. So that means if a user who's using another language sees it in the language that is published under, they can go back and forth between the translations to understand how it can be used. They're designed to release materials worldwide, and they're machine readable and searchable online. So when these tools or licenses or labels are applied to collections, then that means that anyone in the world can reasonably access and understand if there's any permissions or restrictions around them. Now, we do make a couple of distinctions between the Creative Commons licenses and those that are published by rights statements. So Creative Commons, these licenses can be applied if rights arise in the digital materials during the digitization. And the licenses that apply in terms of the definition of open would be CC BY SA or CC BY. But if no rights arise, then you can publish these as either CC0 or using the public domain mark. Related to that, if you're kind of uncertain as to whether rights arise or there may be some underlying questions, a copyright disclaimer can be appropriate as an exception to a statement that is a legal conclusion. So the copyright disclaimer that rights statements puts out is called no known copyright. And that essentially says we're not aware of any, but we actually haven't been able to make a conclusion on that with respect to these works. And so, again, non-commercial and non-derivative restrictions, which are part of the set that are released by Creative Commons, are not actually open. So these are closed licenses, and some of the rights in the bundle of copyright are released by applying them, but they don't qualify as open under all of these international statements, which require commercial use and modification to be permitted in order for something to qualify as open.
And from a user perspective, one of the great benefits, as Andrea alluded to, around using the standard rights statements and licenses is that they have an immediate kind of visibility, legibility for people who, for example, come across them on a museum's collections online. Now, that's particularly important when you think about the opposite, where standard licenses and rights statements are not being used. And you have to, yes, I'm afraid, go to the bottom of that page, click on the link that says terms of use or something similar. And what we have on screen here is a pretty random sample I did of the word count of some GLAM terms of use. So I don't like to shame anyone, but the V&A in London with almost 4,000 word terms of use that you have to get through, is asking the potential reuser of your collections a lot. It's a time investment. There's a lot of legalese, very kind of detailed copyright and rights talk in there. So rather than go down that route, what you can do by using some of the legal tools or licenses, for example, from Creative Commons, is massively simplify that dialogue with potential reusers of collections. So that's one of the reasons why we think these are really valuable.
So one of the reasons that we're seeing a lot of activity around Open GLAM, there's been maybe over the past 5 years, decades, some questions around whether or not institutions should be claiming new rights in the digital reproductions of their public domain works. But in the EU, we've had a new digital single market directive published in 2019 that has an article that addresses this head on. So the article essentially says for works of visual art in the public domain, no new rights can be claimed in any media that's produced during reproduction. So this applies to metadata, text, even workflow documents, things like this, unless there is a very valid copyright that arises. So this kind of eliminates some of that gray area for the EU around whether a copyright arises, because there's some clear signaling in here and in the recitals, which encourages institutions to take the position that no copyright arises. But you'll see here that this article only applies to works of visual art. So we have some questions that have been arising around that kind of scope of creativity that can potentially result in a copyright, or the types of decisions that institutions might make around whether to publish the digital surrogates as public domain based on the underlying works. So of course I have some examples on the very right here, which are very traditional two-dimensional paintings. When we think about digital reproduction of these, there's a lot less scope. These seems very, very, very clearly in the public domain, and they are works of visual art. But things that are not works of visual art, things that maybe require transfer from a 3D to a 2D format, in terms of the digital reproduction, there will be some questions that remain open around that. So one of the things that we've been encouraging institutions to do is to interpret this as all works that are part of the public domain, but also thinking critically about the underlying materials as relevant to answering that question. So it could be inappropriate to publish someone else's cultural heritage to the public domain and to make that decision for them. At the same time, when we start to make exceptions or exclude different types of subject matter that have historically been categorized as craft, or antiquities, we then start to see some gender imbalance in terms of what materials are clearly in the public domain compared to what materials institutions could continue to claim rights in. And this is important to think about when we get to these questions around what's going to happen as institutions look at their existing digital collections and begin to publish them to the public domain for this type of reuse, which we'll revisit a bit later.
So the copyright directive has been and is still being transposed into the national legislatures across the member states of the EU. It's taking a while, as these things do, but already we have seen some major impacts from the directive. I got two on screen here. On the left, the Albertina, wonderful museum in Vienna in Austria, a few months ago released all of its eligible, so public domain works of art, over 150,000 of them into the public domain, a complete shift from in copyright previously to now public domain mark. So it's very encouraging to see. And more recently, I discovered on the right-hand side, the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp, across the border in Belgium, similarly are using CC0, and very high resolution images are available for free download and reuse. So these are some, I think, important signals that the directive is having an impact.
So just to kind of give you an idea of where we are now, the directive has come out in the EU. We're past the implementation date, but we haven't seen activity in terms of implementation across all the member states. And then because of these gaps that we kind of highlighted, we're seeing that copyright is continuing to remain a policy decision in terms of what we refer to as copyright compliance. So if something is not original enough to attract a copyright, at the moment of its making, it's part of the public domain. And so that's what we refer to when we mean copyright compliance, because it's actually complying with copyright law to retain the same public domain status. But something that we're also seeing, and which we'll show you some data on in a little bit, is the data that we're collecting on institutional practices around the world is that there are still these desires, very justifiably so, to communicate to users that they should really be citing the institution or even the artist as the author and the source of the work. And for these reasons, a lot of institutions are saying, well, we don't mind about commercial use, but we'd really like to make sure that people attribute the work to us. So we see open licenses applied as kind of a way to communicate to users that they should be citing the works. But it's really important to note that to apply a copyright license, you have to have a copyright, right? So when we look at the scope of information, we have collected almost 1,500 open or institutions that are engaging in open practice and policy, but only 170 of those institutions out of that almost 1,500 comply with this idea that things that are digitized that are in the public domain remain in the public domain after digitization. And so we see that copyright compliance is something that isn't a widespread, for maybe various reasons, accepted thing across the global GLAM sector. Okay, so now we're going to show you a few examples of some Open GLAM in practice.
So the Statens Museums for Kunst, the National Gallery in Denmark, is I think a pioneering institution for its open policies. They have had open access since 2016. They're using the CC0 rights waiver Andrea mentioned a while ago for their out of copyright collections, and they release very nice high resolution images on their dedicated site SMK Open. Now, the overall mission of the institution is top left here, is to digitize and make the collection universally accessible, is really a key part of fulfilling their strategy. So always important to consider what open access means in relationship to the overall mission of the institution. So let's try and keep that link in our minds as we move through this presentation. And what they also said at SMK is that making their collections available digitally on radically open, completely open terms gives them a new way of realizing their obligation as a national gallery, which, as they say, is to make sure that the museum becomes a relevant and useful resource for everyone, wherever they are. So if you're local in Copenhagen, yes, you may visit the building. When you visit the building, you could see probably 1% of the overall collections on display any one time. So even on a very basic access level, providing open access to their digitized collections immediately magnifies and expands the range of collections which can be experienced. And of course, for people who aren't fortunate enough to be able to travel to Copenhagen or to Denmark or even to Europe, being able to see those collections online in high quality and reuse them for everyone else in the world is, you can see, is integral to their overall purpose. Now, one of the examples here of how this is put into practice at SMK is SMK Connect. This is a education platform for schools all over Denmark that really seeks to place their cultural heritage that they manage and make it come alive for students, curriculum developers, teachers, anyone in that educational ecosystem, to use the artworks, to access them, and to help students develop their critical thinking, creative skills, and also their digital literacy. Another part of SMK's open strategy is what I call multi-platform publishing. So this is really publishing open and high quality collections, yes, on their own website, but also in other channels, in other places to reach people where they already are. So this is a great way of boosting the visibility, the brand awareness of the collection and also of the institution. The photograph here is from a very cozy looking Wiki Labs Culture, a regular citizen science community group, which has been welcomed into SMK since 2015. So there can be a nice sort of local and in-person aspect to open as well.
So another example, of course, that should be closer to home is Museums Victoria, which has a really wide sweeping collection of different subject matter that could potentially be copyrightable upon digitization. But we're really thinking here again about these goals of making these collections available, searchable, connectable, over 1.15 million records being published since 2015. And thinking about the images that accompany them, so continuing to update and add information online while making it reusable through primarily public domain and CC BY licenses to the extent that those licenses are appropriate or able to be applied. And to give you an example of what this looks like in practice, we have a really excellent example of communication about the Open GLAM collection. So this user interface is very much designed to assist the person viewing that specific work in identifying how it can be used or under what restrictions. So we have really plain language that says, can I use this image without permission? There's clear attribution information on here. We also have conditions of use on the page reference, which is also a bit rare to think about in terms of the actual item that's being presented, and very well appreciated because it can differ from one item to the next. And then of course, direct links to the CC information that show, oh good, sorry, I wasn't watching the animations. Direct links to the CC information that show specifically what can be used with that kind of the reference to the license, but also a link to find out more. So this provides a lot of clarity on licensing and text and image content. Users can also download at different image sizes, which helps in terms of delivery, bandwidth and processing, especially on the user end, who may only need a small image as opposed to something as large as 3,000 pixels on the longest side. And then finally, there's a section that says we support the open release of data information about our collections, and it links to the open definition that we referenced in the beginning. So we do see this kind of open definition used by institutions to ground and communicate to users and to each other about what is open and what isn't. But we also have, Doug, if you can create, for certain materials, a cultural sensitivity message. And these actually I've seen, and I think Doug has also seen, are more common, particularly in New Zealand and Australia and other geographic areas that can potentially hold, collect, or manage materials that belong to the peoples who remain in those areas. So for example, you may not see this specific sort of thing in a lot of UK collections, even though they hold these types of works. So there's a really important, relation back to the people who own and associate with the cultural heritage themselves.
Another, I think, first-rate example of open practice is across the Atlantic. From here, the Cleveland Museum of Art, the mission is to create transformative experiences through art for the benefit of all the people forever. Cleveland have been open using the CC0 waiver once more since January 2019 for its out of copyright collections and, again, high quality, high resolution images. Now, the benefits which Jane Alexander, the digital lead at Cleveland, has noted since Cleveland went open is that they've noticed increased updating of attribution, provenance, and collections information. Cleveland were very radical in releasing all of their provenance data back in 2019 on open access terms, so really exposing the underlying data about the collections. Curators connected with Cleveland and their collections have forged new connections with scholars through Open. And internally, it's been quite transformative because resources have been reallocated from people that spent their days, weeks responding to image requests, and they've been moved on to more meaningful and interesting work around supporting digitization, improving the catalog information, and so on. And the big difference that's been noticed at Cleveland is that online users now almost always self-serve from the excellent online collections website, which of course frees up valuable staff time. Another admirable aspect of Cleveland's open program is they have a whole series, and this is just one of live online dashboards using their APIs, which can show you all kinds of information. For example, the most viewed works in the collections, the engagement and visibility of collections based around departments, for example, so Chinese art in comparison to their drawings section. And this is a really great way that's been informative for curators, staff members at Cleveland, at the museum, but also is just as visible to us to see what's happening with the open program and with user engagement. And 3D innovation has also been part of Cleveland's open program. So in September 2019, they extended the open policy to their excellent 3D images of public domain artworks from the collection. They have a major partnership with Sketchfab, the 3D platform I'm sure many of us will be familiar with. And finally, for Cleveland, partnerships were a really important part of their open program from the very beginning. So it's not just about what Cleveland as a museum can do on its own, but it, from the very start, developed specific partnerships to reach audiences and different markets, if you like, for its collections and its brand. And just some of them are up on screen here.
So another great example of a local institution, one that's more medium-sized, is Birmingham Museums Trust in the UK. So they have been open access since 2019, publishing their images through their data asset management system directly for self-service online for users and for their own staff. And they publish everything from medium to high resolution images marked as CC0. So they've seen a number of benefits, some of which have also mapped on to different benefits that other institutions have been seeing. So for example, they estimated about £100,000 in press coverage when announcing their open access policy. This is a number that's similar to the New York Public Library when they also did the same in 2017, 2018. And so we're seeing value shift in terms of what that revenue and kind of understanding of what licensing brings to the institution shift to value and indirect value in terms of open licensing. And so these sorts of metrics are really challenging us to think about what the goals of the open access program are and how we measure them as being different from those that are revenue, income generation based and related to the licensing of the images. And one of the things that they've also seen is their entire collection being lifted and put on different platforms to reach different users, where they also have access to that data like Unsplash and can track and see what the interests of the users are that are completely different from how the interface that they may encounter through the institution would present those works to them. There's been some really interesting data generated around this. So because there's more and more activity shifting to this kind of open GLAM policy throughout the movement, we're seeing a lot of interesting developments because we have a lot more data to reflect on what's been done to date. So really want to nod to the risk takers, the people who have done this stuff to generate that data, because it's showing us some really important principles need to be embedded maybe more critically through how we address intellectual property when we think about copyright and licensing, especially what preservation, management, and dissemination means. These are related to both material and immaterial culture, but especially culture that may not be part of the institution's collection in terms of when we think about historical lenses of looting and colonization and things that happen in and around the areas where cultural institutions sit. Also, especially where objects travel and where they end up, starting to think about who should be making these decisions around these works in different ways that can actually then reflect on the practices around the Cultural Heritage Institute. And so I know I'm preaching to the choir about this because there's so much of this work going on in Australia and in New Zealand, and I see some recognizable names in the participants, so glad to see that. But one of the things, that this is starting to kind of challenge is more awareness around these complex issues, not just related to Indigenous cultural heritage and intellectual property, but also personal data, privacy, the types of ethics and ethical questions that arise when we deem something to be in the public domain because that exploits or that exposes that material to potentially global exploitation and additional forms of wealth and knowledge extraction. So one of the things that a lot of institutions are now starting to do is really think critically, of course, about this and how we can generate more data around these critical approaches and even think about restitution as being relevant to digital and intellectual property.
So this is another example. This is from Trove, of course. You'll be familiar with cultural advice, which is immediately presented to me, the user, yesterday around cultural sensitivities and raising awareness of that. So I've got a very simple, I think, important example of this practice, which is growing and speaking from a European perspective for a moment. This is something that we're seeing grow and have traction amongst European collections. So more cultural advice, sometimes content warnings is a phrase that's used around particular types of content for online collections. So very much I think an important, but it's still a work in progress.
So because we focused on Open GLAM and thinking about the types of materials that institutions can apply these licenses and tools to for the purpose of reuse, we also wanted to signal some systems that help us think differently about the materials and whether we need to carve out spaces and more frequently that set materials aside from public domain statuses. And so there's some really great work going on by Indigitization, which is looking at digitization by First Nations and for First Nations, containing First Nations knowledge, thinking critically about levels of access and the types of technologies that get applied to Indigenous cultural heritage as being something that should be led and directed and informed by the local value systems. Another one, of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is local contexts. And the things that are important about these sorts of initiatives is that they can only be applied by the specific groups that are associated with the heritage. So institutions can't decide to apply some of the local context labels to digital materials without first contacting and engaging the relevant group within that conversation, because really that is the choice that should be made by the group themselves. So we wanted to signal this type of work that's also going on.
So shifting focus for a moment, where are we today with the overall status, if you like, the progress of Open GLAM around the world? Well, as you might know, Andrea and I have been researching this for almost 5 years, 5 years next month, Andrea. And what we see here is that over 1,400, in fact, almost 1,500 GLAMs have released at least some open access data, so compliant with the terms which we opened this talk on, and that totals over 85 million open access digital objects. So this really is I think it's still growing and sizable movement today. But let's also look at the way that we've done this. So the Open GLAM survey, which is on screen here and linked below, is a gigantic spreadsheet, to put it in the simplest terms, that records how GLAMs have made open access data, for example, their rights and licensing policies. Now, whether the objects are digital or it's metadata or text available for reuse. And there is a huge amount more detail here in the spreadsheet, which we cannot do justice to in 30 seconds. So if you're interested to see and get into the details of this, then please check out the link bit.ly/OpenGLAM survey and let us know what you think.
And so one of the things that you can do with this list that we wanted to kind of show you is you can sort by the different levels of access, the different licenses and approaches that are applied. And even we have a column that looks at whether the institution takes the approach that they apply this open access policy to all eligible data, or they take an approach where they have a copyright policy in place and then publish things kind of as an exception to that copyright policy. And there can be really useful information in documenting the different types of practices that go on with institutions that take a bit of a step-by-step approach, because you start to see the different ways in which they're engaging and can test the waters and develop their own internal practices before they potentially embrace a public-facing and collections-wide policy. But within the institutions in Australia, if you went and you searched by country and then you sorted by all and some eligible data, you would see that there are 3 institutions in Australia that publish all eligible collections to the public domain: Museums Victoria, National Museum Australia, and Queen State Archives. And so we could say that these are all copyright compliant, or we could say that they're all public domain compliant, because copyright and the public domain are sine qua non. So feel free to go in and look at some of these. The idea is that as you move along the columns, you can even check out the rights policies that they have publicly available, the locations where they publish data. So institutions can use this as a resource to see what other people within their jurisdiction are doing. So one thing that, of course, we wanted to highlight is the Australian Libraries and Archives Copyright Coalition statement on public domain works. And so, of course, the best practice position as put out by the coalition is that some reproductions of public domain works will create a copyright, but essentially we really need to think about whether the photographer has made any decisions, creative decisions, that would justify new rights arising during that work, because it is a different work. It's not a copy of the source work. It is a different work entirely that, of course, reproduces within some context that work itself. So we could think about, an exhibition installation and things like this, as opposed to an image that is taken straight on. And even thinking about some decisions that may be available for the photographer as being technical rather than creative. So these are the things that we should be thinking about when we're assessing copyright and deciding whether to claim new rights.
So to return to the mission, or what are museums for, question for a moment. This is a word cloud based on a selection of museum mission statements. They have a usually pretty common vocabulary, words like enjoyment, understanding, heritage, people, etc. So let's keep that in mind and then think about the access policies which institutions have. So we focused a lot today on the public domain and copyright management or licensing, open access. Are access policies for digitized public domain collections actively supporting and beneficial to the mission of the institutions? Or if they're not, how might that be changed? What could be improved to make that true?
So one of the things that we've been looking at in terms of the data and thinking about is why we should start designing open access policies that are sustainable rather than aligning with the law for all of its uncertainties and complexities, okay? Because if we have materials that are in the public domain and the cultural institution digitize them, there's a fair bit of autonomy and leeway because the institution themselves is deciding whether or not to claim the new rights or to publish them to the public domain. And those are rights that are within the institution's control to waive, even if a jurisdiction like the UK doesn't formally recognize copyright waiver within the legislation. There are tools like the CC0 license, which we've dropped a note in about the chat, which allow institutions to apply that so that the user will know they will never actually be subject to any sort of legal claim for reusing that content. So that's important in jurisdictions where there may be legal uncertainties around whether copyright arises. And that's also important when we think about cross-border users who sit within those jurisdictions, even if the institution is in a jurisdiction that would recognize those works as being in the public domain. So one of the reasons we should be thinking about this is because the law is increasingly moving forward in terms of embracing the public domain protections, thinking about copyright exceptions, and thinking about ways that the public can access the digital market if and wherever it exists. So embracing a more open policy and thinking about public domain materials as remaining in the public domain can actually reduce legal costs and reliance on external advice if and when things are updated, new cases come out. It also reduces administration costs related to a licensing service, which we continue to see data about that says it doesn't actually bring in enough money to support the running of the service in most institutions, although there are some exceptions. But starting to even think about those sorts of fees as being based in service rather than copyright business models. And then, of course, the long-term costs related to legacy data and policy updates. So some institutions who took these incremental approaches as far as going to CC BY before public domain or CC0 have said that that actually created a whole amount of additional work for them because they had to go back, update the metadata, think about how it's reflected in the policy. So starting with an open access policy from the beginning is one way to reduce all of these costs, which can and do occur over time. But also because it will help your images and your collections gain relevance. They'll become the ones that are most circulated online. It will expand your user base and allow users to continue to generate knowledge around the collection, whether it's citizen scientists, everyday people, researchers, what have you. But also as a way to commit to equity, diversity, and inclusion through digital strategies and educational missions, because we're reducing the financial barriers to accessing and reusing the collections in ways that allow people who may really rely on those images to advance their careers to reuse them, but also everyday people. And this is really important when we think about who decides to use what and what they focus their attention on, because the users and the people who hold knowledge around some of these collections can start to contribute to them in ways they wouldn't otherwise be able to if that policy was closed. Lastly, how to design a sustainable policy. So really thinking about applying the policy to all public domain works as a starting point, and then making exceptions based on whether there's personal data, cultural sensitivities, and even whether access itself is important. So what we are seeing is that when we start to embrace that public domain things remain in the public domain, which is a starting position even globally, you then start to realize how maybe copyright has been applied as a blunt tool to protect the digital materials and the underlying cultural heritage, as a way to communicate to users that certain reuse, or we would like to police reuse, to make sure that it is actually appropriate, in that process. But when we start to think, oh, if I publish this, it will be in the public domain because there may be no rights in this, then we start to think, is it actually okay to be published online? Should we be thinking about different types of parameters that should apply? And that opens up interesting questions around the various labels that do exist to help us manage these types of materials more appropriately. Again, using the CC0 public domain dedication as a way to increase legal certainty for users around reuse, and then publishing images at resolutions that are suitable for print and embed the highest quality metadata. Lastly, uploading to multiple platforms, thinking creatively about where users are and meeting them in the ether instead of asking them to come to you. Because if you meet them on other platforms, they will naturally find their way back to your institution.
So the consequences of closed access are pretty well documented now. Just two examples here in my old field, art history, that Dr. Bender Grosvenor in the UK had a campaign around museum image fees, essentially suggesting that non-open access to public domain art collections, for example, in the UK, were really hurting art historical research. And as documented by Dr. Catherine Rudy at University of St Andrews and her work in the medieval field, the huge expenses of doing scholarly work involving images from non-open collections are very kind of punitive, and often, of course, is the case now that it is the scholars, the researchers, historians themselves who are footing the bill in the thousands and thousands of pounds, euros, or other currencies for doing this. So this, I would suggest, goes directly against the mission and aims of these collections themselves, these institutions. So it's worth reflecting on the consequences of the status quo of closed access where that's present.
And then lastly, I think we're coming up on time, Doug, so I might ask you to just go ahead and click through some of the animations. But one of the things that we're also starting to see is that false copyright claims are starting to erode users' respect for closed access and respect for copyright in a way that there's some incredibly complex questions that may occur in, prior to publishing in the public domain. If that question results in a restriction, we do want users to understand that closed access is applied for a reason that they need to respect. So when we see blanket copyright applied across collections that are dubious in terms of whether they attract copyright, we then see these types of reactions where users say copy fraud. We also, of course, have jurisdictions and massive platforms that recognize this principle that users follow when they're starting to encounter works kind of in the digital wild. So it's something to keep in mind in terms of also advancing respect for copyright compliance and closed access. And then lastly, one of these, these sticklers around commercialization has always been, well, if someone's profiting from this, we would like to. But we want to point out that, this really kind of takes the public domain and says, we can commercialize it, but you can't. And if something's in the public domain, it's available for everyone to commercialize. There are sometimes other reasons put forward, like we need to respect, the artist's moral rights, or we need to think about, the artist's integrity and what they would want this work to be reused. If you move along this moon that we've made, we have an oven mitt that's been produced by the Uffizi Gallery. So, some of these questions can be easily unpicked, but making it available for everyone to commercialize doesn't remove your own ability to commercialize the works. It just levels the playing field so everyone can do it.
And Marita Sanderhoff from SMK crystallizes this well when she says it's difficult or expensive to get images of artworks from museums. People are just going to look for them elsewhere. I think that's a very nice summary of it. So to close, Andrea.
Yeah, so coming back to this idea of a culture of copyright, starting to inject public domain language, licenses, tools, these sorts of things into the digital public domain, if we're thinking about that as being a physical place, is one way to start getting a little bit more user literacy around what copyright means. It reduces the barrier to entry, and it also does that internally within the institution, which may or may not have copyright expertise. So we're seeing legal and organizational statements really advancing this claim that public domain work should remain in the public domain. And this is a way to give institutions and anyone who's digitizing works greater legal certainty around that so they can act on it. One of the challenges, of course, is that lawmakers make very complicated and confusing laws. They also continue to reduce budgets for cultural institutions. And then we have lawyers that say, it depends anytime you ask. So again, starting to think about really with this premise of public domain being public domain is a great way to plant your feet and start taking small steps forward. But the challenges, of course, become exacerbated because of stressed economic, technical, and human resources, all of which are required to go open access in and of themselves.
Yeah, and the power of the status quo or institutional risk aversion is, I think, a real challenge for Open GLAM to grow. Cultural institutions are often quite conservative, sometimes with reasonable reasons. They're also commonly, there's a quantification culture. What you can't measure can be difficult to prioritize in that mindset, and sometimes often the organization's priorities simply lie elsewhere. They're just focused on different things, and open access is not a priority for them.
And I think we've actually been seeing some comments in the chat around some of this, but Open GLAM makes digital collections genuinely accessible and reusable because we go with those upfront permissions. And that in and of itself supports the mission of cultural institutions in a way that expands the digital strategy and the digital public mission. It also, as we're seeing, drives the reach of digital collection and improves the institutional brand as users continue to kind of make their way back to the institution. And then, Doug, if you want to finish the slide.
Yeah, as we've seen, it's an opportunity to create and have created by others, importantly, new knowledge. It supports education and creativity. So key aspects of most institutions' missions, open access is something that can drive those. And as we saw from Birmingham and also Cleveland, it can be transformative inside institutions with smarter resource allocation. And on that note, we'd like to thank you very much for listening and welcome your comments and questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Yep. Just start my video. Thank you so much. That was amazing, as always. That was really interesting, and I hope that there is some questions from the audience for you, but if not, I have some. We'll just wait a little bit. I think one of the main things that has come out of this was a question from Elliot, actually, looking at the mission, reconciling the mission statement with access. So if an institution adopts open and their online audiences grow through discoverability and use, how does an organization reconcile objectives tied to their physical location with ambitions to make their collection widely available in the world, and how do they upsell open internally into funders? I'll put it in the chat.
There's, I think, like 3 questions in there. So I might just dump my thoughts and then invite Doug to do his too. We are seeing, these actually funders, I think, are driving a lot of open access work, especially when we see institutions that are publishing specific sets of collections under open licenses or to the public domain. And I think that's actually really important for a couple of reasons. First, it provides the resources for institutions to be able to digitize and think about how they're redesigning the system from within. It produces good data for the institution then take to decision makers to kind of advance that internally and say, hey, take a look at this. We've done it. The sky hasn't fallen. And I think maybe we should do this for the rest of collections. And then at the same time, it also ends up resulting in some really interesting unexpected activities and things, you know, that the institution sees as being part of the digital mission in a different way. And something that, you know, a lot of institutions kind of brought up and when I was doing some interviews for a report that I dropped a link into in the chat, is that they kind of started to reflect back on their mission with respect to the local economy, local creators, and really wanting to invigorate and provide the institution as a resource for, you know, kind of the creative industries even 200 years ago, right? And so thinking about how those infrastructures have shifted to digital has been really transformative for those institutions to think about meeting their mission in the 21st century.
Thanks, Andrea. Douglas, do you have any thoughts you'd want to add?
Yeah, just to add to that what we quite commonly see now is really, to simplify it, almost two business models for institutions. So a museum will have a physical model around its building, so all about, you know, ticketing, retail, you know, visitor experience, and so on, and then have a related but subtly different kind of online virtual digital model to say, well, you know, what are the things that we would like to achieve with our brand, with our reputation, with our collections around knowledge sharing and so on in the digital domain. I think it's that second part, the digital business plan, if you like, the strategy, where open can be really, really powerful. So that segmentation of strategy around the building and something around online is quite common now and becoming more valued.
Cool, thank you. I have a question here from Jenny Barber. Can you comment on the challenge of supporting such policies in less developed countries, and are they at risk of being exploited?
So this is, I think, a really important and interesting question, because when we think about publishing something to the public domain, it means everyone can use it for any purpose, and especially these cross-border questions. We're starting to see things where, for example, data sets, digital assets, then get incorporated into massive data sets that are used, you know, for whatever reason. So I think it's really important to think about that question, but also to think creatively about the different technological solutions that could be in place around that. So thinking about, you know, limitations on image quality, not low, but, you know, medium, what sort of information needs to accompany the data sets or the images, you know, or the items themselves if they're published, and bringing more attention to that. One of the things that I've been writing on with a colleague is this idea of digital restitution and intellectual property restitution as being something that allows the countries or the communities that have historically had power and still have power to withdraw rights and even ownership of both intellectual property and digital property, transfer that back to the community of origin in a way that then limits access and creates the same systems of exclusion, to think about how we're rebalancing those dynamics and using the law to do that, as opposed to trying to think about new laws and you know, these sorts of things that require an incredible amount of time. So I'm not sure I have all the questions to that, but I think it's a really important question that needs to underlie a lot of the things that we digitize, but also thinking about how maybe we decide to digitize things differently according to those principles, and stop, you know, focusing on the things that we see as having commercial or economic value, which historically we've digitized because we could license them and we could commercialize them, and starting to think about where those gaps are in terms of representation that can be filled through a digitization strategy that embeds EDI or DEI or whatever you call it in your region.
Oh, thank you for that. We've got a couple more minutes left. Douglas, did you want to talk to that question at all? I've got one question here.
Please go ahead, Sarah.
Okay. This is from Richard White, Kia ora from the deep south of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Regarding the slide early on that said a relatively small proportion of institutions were copyright compliant, something like 1,300 were not, this brought home to me that the practices you're describing are still the exception rather than the rule. What do Andrea and Douglas think things look like in 5 or 10 or 50 years?
Yeah,
I'm a very reluctant futurologist. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah.
It is a great question. I'd say gradual improvement, incremental change seems reasonable. The reason I say that is because one thing that we've noted from friends, colleagues, meetings with institutions, large, small, medium, is that even in some of the major institutions, there just isn't sometimes the resources or perhaps some of the kind of knowledge around copyright and licensing that drives, if you like, more clarity and accuracy around policy. So just a few weeks ago, I ran a kind of a digital strategy workshop for a major Dutch institution, major art museum, and even though they're in the top 10 best funded institutions in this country, they did not have a dedicated sort of copyright person, that's a term. And so what I was sort of chatting them through, well, public domain is public domain, compliance with Dutch law means this for your collections. There was some surprised looks around the room. So that's just one anecdote, but I think that's reasonably symptomatic of where a lot of institutions are around copyright and collections management. So I think slow incremental improvement is something that I would hope for. That's my sense.
And I definitely agree with that. One thing that that I think work that's going on at the moment is really important for is thinking critically about how we build that vision in 50 years that we want to see. And so really starting now by thinking critically about what open access is and should be, so that as we see more institutions adopt it, the type of data that then is published and available in 5, 10, 50 years is increasingly representative of the global majority and that knowledge, as opposed to what it is now. So if you go and you look at what we're kind of collecting data on, there's a couple of limitations to it. We have to be able to access policies to ensure and vet that the institution has published things under an open license, which is why it's really useful for us when people use these standardized tools. But also we rely on data aggregators and other sorts of places that make this data useful for us to collect. So that's kind of a natural and financial bias that materializes in the survey, especially when you look at the geographic picture of who's publishing and what they're publishing. So we have a lot of representation in wealthier countries and countries with histories of colonization and with encyclopedic collections. And along with that, we have the associated knowledge, the context, the metadata of those perspectives being published along with the works. So I really want to think critically about how, we get to that place in 50 years that doesn't reinvent the wheel, but starts to make that activity from the outset more inclusive and representative of the global majority.
Mm-hmm. We are a little bit over time. Thank you for that, Andrea and Douglas. Richard, I hope that answers your question. He's just put in the chat. Thanks both. You're doing such important work in this space to give us all proper evidence on which to have meaningful discussions about our approaches. Yeah, noting the biases as well. Cool. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining us and for kicking off the ADA Forum 2023 with our first satellite event.